Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Earl Pike, and I have the honor of serving as Executive Director of University Settlement. For those of you who are just now joining us, you missed an incredible session moderated by Jim Roblenau, an author here in Cleveland, where we got an intimate sort of conversation with Dr. Eberhardt about her childhood here in Cleveland, her roots here in Cleveland, and how that shaped her experience. So based on that conversation and reading her book, I'm so looking forward to this talk today. But I think we have to start by sort of acknowledging what an incredible year this has been. A global pandemic of a novel virus, the murder of George Floyd and the call to recommit to racial justice, struggling economy, and just plain fear and grief and rage. We've all been through a lot, and some of us have been through a lot more than others. The burden is not equally distributed. But we're here now, and we're committed to the ongoing effort of racial justice. Because of that, I have to give a special shout out to the staff at University Settlement. We did not shut down this last year. In fact, we were at 95% capacity all year. So the 43 staff and the hundreds of volunteers who came here every day over the last year, feeding families, teaching kids, making sure that seniors were safe, holding families together, et cetera, et cetera. The work that you did in the community was just extraordinary. And I can't tell you how grateful I am just to be able to work with you side by side. I also want to give a special shout out to former City Councilwoman Phyllis Cleveland. I'm having a hard time saying former City Councilwoman because I have such admiration for the Councilwoman, both as a person and her 16 years of public service. So we want to acknowledge that. Phyllis, I'm now calling you Phyllis rather than Councilwoman. Phyllis, we have a little something for you at the end of this. And we also want to welcome her replacement, the newest City Councilwoman, Dolores Gray. And of course, we want to thank our sponsors, most especially our presenting sponsor, the Third Federal Foundation, as well as the Andrews Foundation, Anna Maria Mata, and all of you who through your contributions and your ticket purchases help make the work that we do here possible. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Kurt Caracol, who has the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eberhardt. Last week here in Slavic Village, nearly 200 people showed up for a mass vaccination at the Third Federal offices. Hundreds and hundreds of people helped with that effort. That's a testament to Kurt's leadership. The success of that event is a testament to Kurt's leadership. And it happened again yesterday, where we had another nearly 200 people get vaccinated. In fact, there's evidence of Kurt's leadership almost everywhere you go in Slavic Village, in every organization, in every school, in every classroom, practically on every block. Kurt's leadership is there to see for everybody. Recently, Kurt announced that he was stepping down, retiring from his position as CEO, president and CEO of the Third Federal Foundation. But that, knowing Kurt and knowing his love for this community, that doesn't mean that he's going anywhere. He's still going to stay involved. And Kurt, we have a little initial something also at the end of this call to thank you for your leadership so far. But with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, our keynote speaker today. Kurt? Kurt, I think we're missing the audio.
Got it. Okay. Got
There
it.
we go.
Can you hear me? Okay, good, good. Thank you.
You're
Thank
great.
you for that great introduction, Earl. Thank you for those kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kurt Caracol. I'm President and Executive Director of the Third Federal Foundation. And Third Federal Savings has been a fixture in the Slavic Village neighborhood since 1938. They've been a partner of University Settlement since its inception. And since the foundation was created in 2007, we have worked in great partnership with all the amazing work that University Settlement does for the people of this neighborhood. I'm so excited to be able to introduce such a dynamic person as Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. She's a Cleveland native, which is always fun for all of us in Cleveland to know that somebody started here and has done amazing things. She grew up in the Huff neighborhood. She's one of the world's leading experts on unconscious racial bias and has dedicated her career to studying the consequences of the psychological association between race and crime. Her innovative experiments ultimately show how racial bias can lead to disparities in education, employment, housing, and the criminal justice system. And it's so appropriate for her to be here with what we've gone through over this last year. Dr. Eberhardt is internationally sought after for her work with law enforcement agencies to help them improve policing by building and maintaining trust within the communities they serve. Inspired by Silicon Valley innovation, she aims to combine social and psychological insights with technology to improve outcomes in the criminal justice system and beyond. She earned her master's and doctorate degree from Harvard and is currently a professor of psychology at Stanford University. She has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was named one of Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. She is the recipient of a 2014 MacArthur Genius Grant. She also is co-founder and co-director of Spark, Social Psychological Answers to Real World Questions, a Stanford University center that brings together researchers, practitioners to answer significant social problems. She has also been featured in Time Magazine, Forbes, TED Talks, NPR, and The Daily Show. And Kamala Harris, our Vice President of the United States, read her book, Biased, which is an amazing story about the role that race plays in policing. And she said, this book helps us significantly view how racial bias works in our own minds and throughout society. We could not ask for a better guide to understand this reality than Jennifer Eberhardt. Her research reveals critical information that can help leaders better understand how biases can impact our judgment and how we are perceived by the communities we are sworn to serve. As I said, I'm particularly proud to introduce her because we in Slavic Village have gone through a grand experiment over the last 10 years of a P16 program in which we have donated over $1.5 million a year to our Cleveland Public Schools to try to improve the academic performance of those schools. And we've seen over 10 years an amazing job of providing those wraparound services that take away those barriers that poverty creates, how that can create great academic progress. And so I'm really pleased and proud to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt.
Great, thank you, Kurt, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate being invited back home, so to speak, and I'm going to try to share my screen with you. Hopefully that will go okay, and I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. Many have noted that we are living in a moment of racial unrest, and they point to the killing of George Floyd as the spark that ignited a racial reckoning. Yet way before the summer of protests that spread across the country, the Pew Research Center released a report which found that 6 in 10 Americans rated race relations in this country as generally bad. And a majority of Americans feared that things were getting worse. They feared we were slipping back in time. As a nation, we were already struggling to hang on. I conduct research to speak to that struggle. I'm on a mission to bring the science of bias to everyday people. So I'm here today to talk to you about bias, and although we can have biases about all sorts of groups based on all sorts of characteristics, I'm going to focus my remarks here on race. When the average person thinks of racial bias, they think of burning crosses, they think of people who were filled with hate, they think of old-fashioned racism. But I'm a social psychologist, and as a social psychologist, we know that you don't have to be an old-fashioned racist to be biased. Bias can be triggered and can have devastating impact, even when we're not aware of it, even when it's our intention to be fair, even when we are not filled with hate. So during my time here today, I want to demonstrate how racial disparities across a variety of contexts can inspire bias in many people, including us. And that bias can then work to sustain and magnify the disparities that are already there. Now, as an example, I'm going to speak quite a bit here about the Black-white dynamic, where the research is most advanced and where the disparities are most extreme, and where those extreme disparities seem to exist in almost every facet of life. Although African Americans make up less than 13% of the US population, they make up over 33% of the prison population. And that disparity biases us. It changes how we see. And at the root of this process is this cultural association between African Americans and crime. With a number of colleagues, I've conducted studies for the past 20 plus years demonstrating the power of this association. We found that African Americans are so associated with crime that the mere presence of a Black face can lead people to see weapons better. In a typical study, we would invite undergraduates into our lab to participate, and we'd have them sit in front of a computer screen with a focus dot at the center. And then they would see these flashes of light appear around that focus dot. Now, these flashes were actually the faces of young men that were appearing on the computer screen at such a rapid rate that participants couldn't consciously detect them. So here it is again in slow motion. We use what's called a subliminal priming procedure to expose some of our participants to an entire series of Black male faces. We had another group of participants, we exposed them to a whole series of white male faces. And then we had a third group of study participants who didn't see any faces at all. And we found that simple exposure to Black male faces it enhanced their ability to see weapons better. So they were able to detect guns from blurry images better, for example. And bias can not only control what we see, it can control where we look. Prompting people to think about violent crime can lead them to look toward a Black face and away from a white face. Prompting police officers to think of shooting or arresting or capturing can lead their eyes to settle on Black faces too. Bias can also make its way into the courtroom. It can affect how we punish. It can even play a role in death sentencing decisions. In a large data set of death-eligible defendants, we found that looking more Black more than doubled the chances that those defendants would receive a death sentence, at least when their victims were white. And this effect is significant even though we control for factors like aggravators and mitigators, we control for the severity of the crime, we even control for the defendant's attractiveness. And no matter what we controlled for, we found that Black defendants appear to be punished in proportion to the Blackness of their physical features. The more Black, the more death-worthy. Bias can move from the courtroom to the schoolhouse. It can shadow our children as they learn. In a recent study by Andrew Todd and colleagues, they found that people associate the faces of Black kindergartners with crime. In a laboratory study, they asked people to look at a computer screen and to categorize the objects they saw as either guns or toys, and to do this as quickly as possible. Now, they also saw children's faces, which they were told to ignore. So I want to immerse you in the study here. So you see a child's face, you're told to ignore that face and to just say whether that object was a gun or a toy. Gun or toy. Gun or toy. Gun or toy. And they found that mere exposure to Black children's faces led people to identify the guns more quickly. Bias can move from the prisons to the streets. It can seep into our schools. It can shadow our children as they learn. At the next stop on this tour, I want to talk about how bias can influence how teachers discipline their students. My colleagues and I have found that teachers express a desire to discipline Black middle school students more harshly than white students for the same repeated infractions. In a recent study, we're finding evidence of racial bias even when those infractions are not committed by the same child. So, for example, if one Black child misbehaves and then a few days later, a different Black child misbehaves, teachers respond to that second Black student as if he's misbehaved twice. It's as though the sins of one Black child get piled onto another. One Black child can stand in for another, yet white children are treated individually. There's a threat in the air, and that threat follows Black students into schools and onto streets and into neighborhoods. It follows them as they grow older and wiser and as they attempt to enter the workplace. In a now classic study, two economists, Bertrand and Mullinathon, examined the role of race in US hiring decisions. And they were interested here in entry-level positions, positions like parking attendants and jobs as dishwashers and office clerks and so forth. And they developed 5,000 resumes, and they systematically varied the race of the applicant. And then they sent these resumes around to employers who were advertising for jobs in Boston and in Chicago. And they found that those resumes with Black sounding names, they received 50% fewer callbacks than the same resumes with white sounding names. Now, this particular study was conducted in 2004, yet these results have held up over time. In a recent meta-analysis that examines studies like this conducted over the past 25 years, we see that African-American applicants, they continue to receive fewer callbacks. Bias and concerns about bias are even present when it comes to what businesses people invest in. In fact, with the private investment firm, we've begun looking at the causal role race could play in investment decisions. And here to examine this, our study participants were asset allocators. And we presented these professional investors with these one-page descriptions of highly qualified venture capital teams. And we used photographs to depict the managing partner of each team as either white or as Black. And we found that the investors evaluated the highly qualified Black-led teams more negatively in terms of their track record, in terms of their expertise, in terms of their ability, despite the fact that they were looking at the identical credentials. In fact, we're finding that the more qualified the Black-led teams are, the more bias they face. When we look at who is in the investment industry, the racial and the gender disparities are about as extreme as you can get. And the question is, how do these disparities feed bias? How might these disparities influence the evaluation of pitches? Who looks too risky? Who looks investment worthy? So in this space too, disparity can be self-perpetuating. So what do we do? What do we do when racial bias is all around us? It's in our workplaces, our schools, our police departments, our courtrooms. What do we do? I want to argue here that although racial bias can touch our lives in so many ways, we are not doomed to be under its grip. We're all vulnerable to bias, but we don't act on bias all the time. Instead, bias is triggered by the situations we find ourselves in. And as researchers, we know a lot about what those situational triggers are. Responding quickly is a trigger for bias. Using subjective standards to evaluate others rather than objective standards, that's a trigger for bias. Lack of accountability is a trigger. Lack of training. The list goes on and on here. Even our emotional states matter. When we're feeling threatened or fearful, that could be a trigger for bias. Cultural norms matter. So if we're in an environment with weak egalitarian norms, that could be a trigger for bias. So this is where bias happens. Now, much of my work focuses on African Americans, but these situational triggers are at work regardless of the group that's targeted by bias. And they're at work not only within us as individuals, they're at work in the systems we build. So let me give you an example. Most people are familiar with the tech company Nextdoor. Well, their whole purpose is to create stronger, healthier, safer neighborhoods by creating an online space where neighbors can gather and share information. Yet they soon discovered that they had a problem with racial profiling on the platform. In a typical case, person would look outside their window, see a Black man in an otherwise white neighborhood, and they would make the snap decision that he was up to no good, even when there was no evidence at all that he was engaging in any criminal wrongdoing. So the co-founder of Nextdoor reached out to me and reached out to other researchers. They were trying to figure out what to do. And they realized that to curb racial profiling on the platform, they were going to need to add friction. That is, they were going to have to slow people down. And let me just say that adding friction was counter to what they knew in their bones about what makes tech products good. Good tech products are easy to use. They're intuitive. In fact, the ultimate goal was for people to use these products without thinking at all. Yet these are the very conditions under which bias thrives. So Nextdoor had a choice to make. And against every impulse, they chose to add friction. And they did this with a simple checklist. There are just 3 items on it. Now, before a user can report suspicious activity, they have to describe what that person was doing that made him suspicious. Being a Black man is not grounds for suspicion. Second, they had to describe that individual person's features, not simply their race and their gender. And then third, Nextdoor discovered that a lot of people didn't know what racial profiling was, nor did they understand that they were engaging in it. And so they offered a definition of profiling to users, and they let them know that it was strictly prohibited on the platform. Now, most of us, we've seen those signs in airports. If you see something, say something. Nextdoor tried modifying this. If you see something suspicious, say something specific. And by simply slowing people down, adding this friction, Nextdoor was able to reduce racial profiling by over 75%. 75% drop. Now, people often say to me, well, you can't add friction to any context, especially for people who are overworked or for people who are making split-second decisions all the time. But it turns out that we can add friction to more situations than we think. Here in California, I and a number of my colleagues, we work with members of the Oakland Police Department to help them to reduce the number of stops they were making. And this was of people who were not committing any serious crimes. And we did this by simply pushing officers to ask themselves a simple question before each and every stop they made. Is this stop intelligence-led? Okay, in other words, like, do I have prior information, prior intelligence to, determine, whether I should stop this person? And if the answer is yes, they had to indicate the source of that intelligence. Now, this procedure forces officers to pause and think, why am I considering pulling this person over? The year before adding that question to the form officers complete during a stop, they made about 32,000 stops across the city. That following year, with the addition of this intel-led question, that dropped to about 19,000 stops. African American stops alone fell by over 43%. And this happened even as the crime rate continued to fall. So stopping fewer Black people did not make the city any more dangerous, as many people feared it would. So how did this intervention work? Well, bias is triggered when we're responding quickly, so we slowed officers down. We changed the standard they were using to evaluate others by pushing them to use evidence of wrongdoing in place of intuition. We increased accountability by introducing a metric to track these intelligence-led stops. And then the department defined what an intel-led stop was and then trained officers on how to spot it. And then the police leadership encouraged these kinds of stops. They changed the norms for what good policing looked like. So not only do we have these individual tools at our disposal to curb bias, we can package these tools together in different ways to produce better outcomes. Is this stop intelligence-led? Sounds like a pretty simple question. Yet there are a lot of psychological principles baked into it. And when you understand the factors that trigger bias, it opens up a huge array of interventions to mitigate it. We've also been able to examine what happens when police officers do make contact with people. By best estimates, about 12% of US drivers are stopped by police each year. That's millions of drivers. And these interactions are consequential. They are the context through which trust is built or trust is eroded on a daily basis. And until now, we didn't really have a good way of observing how officers communicate with the public. But with the spread of body-worn cameras, we now have access to how these interactions unfold in real time. The footage from these cameras allows us to look for patterns across many interactions. And this lets us test the extent to which there are differences in the respect officers communicate to Black and white drivers. So with an interdisciplinary group of researchers at Stanford, we've begun to look at this. We captured footage from nearly 1,000 traffic stops conducted by 245 officers. And we used machine learning techniques to comb through the words officers used during these stops. And we found that even when officers were behaving professionally, they spoke to Black drivers with less respect than white drivers. They used more formal titles with white drivers. They expressed more concern for the safety of white drivers. They offered more reassurance to white drivers. They said, it's gonna be okay, it'll be all right, don't worry, right? In fact, based on the words officers used alone, we could predict whether that officer was talking to a Black person or a white person. In more recent studies with a completely different data set, we're finding that we can use the first 45 words that an officer utters to predict whether that encounter is going to escalate, whether the person stopped is going to get handcuffed, whether they're going to get searched, or whether they're going to get arrested. And we can do this with over 83% accuracy. So if we're looking for ways to change systems, this is low-hanging fruit. Most law enforcement agencies have body cameras, yet the vast majority of the footage from those cameras, it's never examined. So how can we expect cameras to serve as an accountability tool when the footage is not analyzed, when the footage is not even treated as data? And this has implications far beyond traffic stops. We can use this footage to examine how no-knock warrants are executed on Black versus white suspects. We can look at how witness statements are taken. We can look at interrogation practices. We can look at training. In fact, the Oakland Police Department invited us to present the takeaways of our findings in a training on traffic stops. And we're now looking at footage pre and post training to see whether that training made a difference. And this is for real interactions on the street. So we want to talk about system change. This is system change. We're building the tools that allow us to look at police community interactions at scale. Researchers have tried slowing teachers down. They've tried training them to be more empathetic to their students when they misbehave. And they found that this can reduce the suspension rate. Researchers do this by redirecting teachers to broaden their focus. So teachers, they learn about the kinds of worries that could lead a child to feel mistrust and to therefore misbehave. And then teachers provide examples of how they could effectively discipline, how they could discipline in a manner that could pull that child into the community rather than pushing them further away. So this intervention is grounded in the science of relationship building. And using this simple technique, the researchers were able to cut the suspension rates in half. I'm working with these same researchers now to help students who've been pushed into the juvenile justice system to successfully re-enter school. For this intervention, we get students to focus on their values and what they would like to achieve at school, just as they re-enter. We also have them focus on some of the challenges they might face and how they might use positive relationships with adults in the school to help them to face those challenges. And then we ask them to name an adult who they think could be supportive of them. And then next, we ask each student what they would want that trusted adult to know about them. So here's an example. So in essence, we allow these children to tell their stories. We then let the students know that we might be able to share some of their thoughts with that trusted adult. And for half of the students, we write a letter to that adult, telling them about the student's reentry and letting them know that the student identified them as someone they would want to partner with to help them through the transition. And then in the student's own words, we share what that student wanted that adult to know. So what happened? We found that about 70% of the students who were not in our intervention, they went back to the juvenile justice system. So this is pretty similar to what we see nationwide. And we also found that about 64% of the students who got our intervention, they too went back into the system. So not much change there. And so we're finding here that simply being clear about your goals wasn't enough for the students. But for those who got the intervention and that trusted adult received their letter, only 29% recidivated, went back to juvenile detention. We tried this as a pilot study with a small sample of just 47 students in Oakland, and now we're trying to scale it up to other school districts in California. We want justice, we want fairness, we want change. King reminds us that change comes through continuous struggle. He says every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. So you ask, what can we do? you now know that we have many mitigation tools at our disposal to fight bias. We have tools we can use to fight the mere threat of bias. And we can use these tools in our own individual lives, in our institutions, our police departments, our courtrooms, our schools, our companies can use these same tools to increase fairness and justice. There's a lot of power in just the simple things. And we want to keep up the fight at this level, even as we take aim at the harder things. As a nation, we want to take aim at the racial narratives that keep people anchored at the bottom of society. We want to take aim at the structural disparities that those narratives produce and reflect. And that's a much heavier lift. Yet in this too, we can all take part. About 20 years ago, I was on an airplane. I found myself sitting next to a man who was white and from South Africa. And we began talking, and he told me all about his life. Now, at that point in my life, I'd never met anyone who was white and South African, so I had a lot of questions to ask, including questions about apartheid. And I will never forget what this man told me. He looked at me and he said, "I didn't even know what apartheid was growing up." And I said, "What?" I said, "What do you mean? How could you not notice the forced segregation, the racial unrest?" And he said to me, he said, "Well, I understood that Black people were poor and they were segregated." For example, he knew that the Black woman who cleaned his house every week, she lived in a poor area. But he did not understand it as a system of apartheid because those in power did not have access to the language to describe it. That word apartheid was never used on television. It was never used in the news. No one he knew ever spoke of it. Well, I found myself reflecting on that conversation a lot lately. Years later, I can finally comprehend what he meant. The US is in a racial reckoning. Everything is being reassessed. Everything's being reexamined. There are new terms, there's new language to help people to see, things that have been in front of them for their entire lives, but it was hard to see because they had no words for it. So that conversation on that airplane is leading me to wonder, what else don't we see in our own society? What else do we accept without question? There's a difference between who we want to be and who we are now. So let's shift the conversations we're having about race and inequality so we don't slip back in time, so we continue to strive to see one another, so that we continue to strive to see ourselves. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I am so overwhelmed with the amount of rich material and insights you brought to us today. And I'm finding myself with 1,000 questions and wanting to keep you on for the rest of the afternoon, talk about them. And I'm sure many other folks have questions as well. I'm struck by something you said in the earlier session. The doctor was talking about when she first started attending Beechwood High School when she was about 12 years old. And she said, "I had questions and I kept asking them." And I'm struck by the fact that you ended your talk with questions. And so a life asking hard questions has led to extraordinary things. It's actually my pleasure now to introduce Tim Tramble for this next session, which is about questions and answers. And I confess, Tim, that I don't have enough time to do justice to your leadership. For those of you who haven't met Tim, I first met him when he served as executive director of Burton Bell Carr CDC, where he carried out really some of the most transformative, high community engaged community development for new housing, new businesses, even a low watt radio station to serve the community, because that's what the community identified as important. Recently, he was selected, as I think many people know, to head the St. Luke's Foundation, which has a deep community commitment to health disparities, ending health disparities, and fostering racial justice, a mission that really matches Tim perfectly. So at this point, I want to introduce one of my mentors, my friend, and literally one of the best nonprofit leaders in Cleveland, Tim Tremble, to lead this next section of Q&A with Dr. Eberhardt. And if you have questions, make sure to post them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Tim?
Thank you very much, Earl. You're too kind, and I wish I had more time. I want to dive straight in. I wish I had more time to really outline how proud I am. I want to commend you and the board and staff of University Settlement for the outstanding work that you're doing. It's visible. You have things growing up from the ground, and just really excited about what you guys are doing in the Slavic Village area. I want to take a quick moment of time to just thank and honor my good friend Kurt Carrickle and his retirement, my good friend Councilwoman Phyllis Cleveland and her departure from City Council, and congratulate my friend Dolores Gray, who's assuming council leadership. So with that, again, I'm sorry that I can't lean into more of that. I do want to honor Dr. Eberhardt. I'm proud of you, and just let you know personally, I'm proud of you. I don't know if Earl did this on purpose, but I too am from the Huff community. So really proud to see the outstanding talent that my community gave birth to in you. Thank you very much. So with that, jumping right into it, we're going to ask that we all give each other grace, respect, and dignity in our questions, right? As they will be grounded in our goal to learn and expand our perspectives. We want this to be civil and we want this to be inclusive. So with that, I'm going to ask the first question. And I'm sure as I look at the questions coming in, we all want to know how is your research being received by police departments across the country?
Yes, thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be in communication with you and to have an opportunity just to, have this conversation. My work has been received in different ways across time. I've been doing work with law enforcement for, a good while now. I think when I started that work, it was received better. There was less threat in the air, if you will. I think also as a researcher, I could come in to try to help them to solve problems, not simply to sort of litigate the problems. And so they would turn to me, as a person that, could help to uncover sort of what was going on, like sort of how racial bias might play a role in the officers' decision-making at various points and their decision to stop people and their decision to use force and so on. Now it's gotten harder, right? As, tension has grown, as we're in this racial reckoning as a country, as law enforcement, the reputation of the profession has taken a dive, and so it's harder to work with people, when they are under threat. But I feel like the work couldn't be more important now. I feel like as a country, we have to figure out ways to get this right. We have to figure out ways to improve police-community interactions, and so my work is all about that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to combine questions in consideration of time. We have one question relative to how males and females fared in your study. Do females treat African Americans better than males? And the other question I'm going to add to that is, what do you think we can do to scale up your research and interventions?
Yeah, so there hasn't been much of a gender difference in terms of the study participants. We started our work looking at African American males in particular because we felt like the association between race and crime was strongest there, and so a lot of the work that I do is in that direction. And in terms of scaling, the work, one example of that is one of the last studies that I showed was, in trying to help students who have been pushed out of school into the juvenile justice system to re-enter school. We're hoping, if we get good results as we, look at these other areas. So this was in Oakland, like I said, but as we look to San Francisco, as we look to Sacramento, if we get similar results, I think, we will try to scale it up. We'll try to work with the school system to do that, try to work with the, school system to help to create policies that could ease that transition back to school. The body-worn camera work, we're trying to scale that up now. We have several different police departments that we're working with now. We would like the police, sort of policing industry as a whole to start to look at this footage more. It's amazing that, they see the footage, as evidence of, in particular cases, and they